Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nick Ashmore, Marketing Director at QStory. For those of you that don't know QStory, we are the pioneers of integrated automation based here in the UK. And our mission as a business is really simple. We're here to help contact centres become happier, more engaging and more productive places to work. I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Baker at NatWest. Phil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Phil Baker. I'm a customer experience lead at NatWest. NatWest, a lot of you will probably know, we're a well-known high street bank. We cover multiple brands, from Coots right the way through to Ulster Bank and Royal Bank of Scotland. The former being my particular area of focus. When we rolled out QStory, I was the optimization lead, so very much cut my teeth in planning. So now I suppose I've been released front of house to try and implement and carry on the great work that we've been doing with QStory out in the operation. This particular rollout really focuses on our initial rollout into customer contact. So the dimensions of that were like 2,500 agents. We rolled that out to multiple sites, and we rolled that out in approximately 6 months. We had some interesting approaches that we took, which we'll be going into, of course, within the pack, and we've got lots of plans to carry on that rollout across the bank, which we'll also go into. That 2,500 rollout was certainly challenging, certainly fun, and again, some of the things that we found and discovered we'll be going through in the presentation. I think important to understand with that rollout, it was done virtually, it was done during the pandemic, and it was 12 months ago already. So really good, interesting time, and I'm sure some interesting points that we'll be covering. Back over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Phil. So if you just click on for us, Dave. Just thinking back then to the start of the project, Phil, what were some of the key challenges that the bank was trying to solve in their contact centres prior to implementing QStory?
Thanks, Nick. I think there were a couple of things really. I think what this rollout really centred on, though, was a reaction by us to the voice of the employee. There was a real need for us that we recognised to fundamentally change the interaction between our agent population and the business, for want of a better term. On reflection, we found that it was very directional, it was very tell in lots of ways, and it was something that, from certainly a planning point of view, we wanted to change. So there was lots of the recognisable challenges that I'm sure a lot of people on the call will have come across in terms of that disengagement with our planning process, last minute requirements around overtime, changes to shifts, lots of rigidity in terms of our approach. And also as well, I think, that cultural change that we wanted to stimulate was also, being hampered by a kind of multiple amounts of data sources, but with little or no insight, specifically around real-time optimization. So we had a number of challenges that we wanted to tackle. And of course, from a planning point of view, we've really recognized that our planning approach perhaps wasn't where we wanted it to be, certainly in a real-time automation point of view. But there were also lots of challenges within that team around a lot of manual data collation, lots of manual processes that we needed to staff, and actually, on reflection, a lot of failure demand, which from a planning point of view and in a planning team isn't really kind of the best place to be. So there were some of those real key sort of day-to-day challenges that we wanted to address through the QStory. But I think fundamentally it was about tackling our cultural agenda in terms of being able to elevate our customer experience challenges, customer experience output, whilst really meeting those challenges head on in a way that was, I suppose, transparent and authentic, but allowed us to support our customer experience agenda, whilst also tackling some of those planning challenges. So those are probably the main reflections I'd have.
Great. So I think for the rest of this presentation, we're going to drill through the kind of 4 key teams that benefited the best and the most from QStory. So we're going to talk in detail about that colleague agenda. We'll talk about some of the specific functionality for team leaders, how we've impacted the real-time and planning teams, and then finally the impact on leadership. So just taking that colleague agenda in a bit more detail, Phil. So let's think about, I guess, the core deployment that you get with QStory. So with every implementation, it includes our mobile self-service application, which agents can download either on their mobile or on their desktop. Just click on for me, Phil, please, Dave. Thank you. And this self-service application is at the heart of our engagement strategy, isn't it? So it allows colleagues to view their entire schedule for the week, their start times, their finish times. Can even allow them to see where their friends are on break, so they can request to be on the same break time as their friends. They can notify team leaders about sickness or absenteeism, and it can automatically log on all the time that the agents spend working over and past the end of their shifts. So we know this has been super powerful and really impactful with the agents. What is it done in terms of the processes for the bank, Phil?
I think from a very simplistic point of view, it's made the efficiency of that communication far more robust. I touched on some of the challenges that we had from an operational delivery point of view, certainly from a planning perspective in terms of our rigidity and our ability to react to changes in customer demand. And I think that the manual processes that were in place actually hampered us in terms of being able to either articulate a message out to our front line or be able to react to challenges that we were seeing out on the floor. And what the app has allowed us to do is make that communication a lot more seamless. It allows us, yes, still to be reactionary to changes in customer demand and operational volatility, but I think more importantly what it allows us to do is react to those challenges in the right way and at the right time. That app is again a really powerful component, a powerful enabler to the earlier cultural challenges that we were trying to address. And I mentioned earlier that we found that some of that planning approach was quite directive. And a term that I'll use in the presentation going forward is this notion of adult to adult conversations. So we wanted to drive this level of engagement with our agent workforce with the view of being able to deliver improved customer experiences, because they felt that they had the right support, they were in the right skill sets, all of that great stuff, and at the right time. And that very quick ability to sense check that is a really important part of the app. But more importantly, that communication process, I think, allowed us to start positioning the app more importantly as the sort of one-stop shop for the agent. So we can direct a lot of our operational communication through it, but reciprocally it allows them to feedback any changes that they want to make, but more importantly any requests, activities that they demand and require in order to be able to support our customers. So that app in essence, whilst it being a really effective tool for us to communicate with our agent population, it also started driving a bit of ownership and involvement in the dialogue from our agent team, our agent population. So they were starting to feel like they were part of the decision and they were part of the dialogue that was going on in order to be able to develop our real-time planning approach. So I think the key part with it was that almost commoditization, as it were, of the planning process real time to our agent population, but also the ability for them to be able to feed back quite quickly anything that wasn't right, anything that didn't really align to their requirements, but also as well allowed us to be able to start thinking about how they could start requesting coaching support or any other changes to their schedule on the day. Because I think what we started to recognize and how QStory allowed us to get visibility over some of these challenges is that we recognized that our agent population wanted to do a good job. They wanted to be involved in the solution for our customers, but really we felt that we weren't being able to give them the ability to complement that and really to add into that. So the QStory app allowed us to be able to develop a communication tool in the moment, in real time, that then allowed us to drive more I suppose, refined planning decisions in the back of it. So it also played as well a real key part in some of that manual work that I discussed earlier in terms of holiday administration, last minute holiday requests, overtime, yes or no, all of this kind of stuff. And I know another area that we'll touch on later in terms of making time back. What it allowed us to do was then very quickly improve that efficiency of the comms process and also improve our kind of decisioning in the moment.
Yeah, having been on site and spoken to some agents, it's the immediacy that I think they really appreciated, right? So I was speaking to a prospective customer last week, and they had a 48-hour backlog on agent requests. So if you've got this wasn't NatWest or an existing customer, but if you had an urgent request to take time off that day, if there's a 48-hour backlog, it's impossible, right? With QStory, that request is made in the app, and notifications usually received pretty much straight away. And I guess the advantage of the QStory app is it synchronizes with the daily schedule. So any changes that you make to availability of staff is reflected immediately into that daily schedule for the planning team to see straight away. And this stat, I think, is really powerful too. So we've taken all the stats from a single month of February from just that 2,500 seat contact center. So 85% of all the agents in the contact center logged into QStory in the month. So adoption rates are really high because it's their entire schedule. It's their planning life on their phone or on their desktop, which is so powerful for them. So it really does give them autonomy. So
just as I remember as well, that became quite a powerful message for us in terms of that ability and that immediacy, because as you touched on, by the time we were in a position to make a decision for their requirement, world had moved on somewhat. So I think the ability for us to be able to have that kind of dialogue with them in the moment was really good. I think as well, what's really important, just as I remember it more than anything, is that the app doesn't somehow become, the planning process. It's there as an enabler and support to the planners themselves. So what certainly we've seen in terms of the app is that it removes a lot of the pre-work and almost post-work around the value-add activity in terms of either amending schedules or giving people activities that they need in order to perform their job well. So I think whilst it's fantastic, it also allowed a wider enablement of the planning process. Sorry about that, Nick. We're already going off piste. Look.
No problem at all. Let's drill into time bank, because I know this is one of the most popular features. So the way time bank works is it automatically accrues every minute that agents spend on the phone past their shift. So if they're speaking to a customer, it runs past the end of their allotted time. The app automatically accrues that into a time bank for the agents. And I think the agent population absolutely love this, right? Because it's there, it can be booked as holiday or time back through the application at any point. What would talk to me a little bit about, I guess, the process before time bank, or why do you think agents like this so much?
Yeah, I think it's probably something that often people recognise in a planning process. Things like overtime and making time back, making time up, etc., was quite a local process, and of course from that local approach came variation, and it was also extremely difficult to track accurately. So if there was a team leader that happened to be viewing and seeing the agent was still on a call 20 minutes after their shift, invariably they would do a great job at trying to ensure that they logged that in order that that individual could get that time back. Did they do that every time? Did they do that consistently? Absolutely not. No. And I think they recognized that, and because there was their lack of that consistency, naturally that drove disengagement. That there was definitely a view that, certainly in volatile times, which we've had lots of more recently, that did fall to the wayside. So of course you would get some agents that did get their time back, others didn't. Others perhaps got more time back than they should have done. Others were carrying the can perhaps more so than others, and there wasn't that kind of, I suppose, distinct, robust, fair and equitable approach to being able to manage that. And for us, when I come back to that colleague agenda that was so central to this rollout, that was just something that we weren't willing to walk past. So being able to implement a solution that addressed some of that, and we'll come on to some of the other benefits of that. More than anything, I think then drove a level of transparency that the agents could see was fair. And you know, like I'm sure many of the listeners today, you know, we have a strong union presence. We wanted to make sure that they were on the journey with us as well, and they understood the methodology and the reasoning behind this kind of functionality. You know, it hasn't, or potentially could have, quite bad press. I think when we start talking about making time up and ensuring people are, you know, paying back their minutes, then that can often, you know, attract kind of quite negative connotations to that, and perhaps where the contact center industry was 10 or 15 years ago. But actually what became really apparent with the time banking functionality was that it was about fairness, and about, if we've got the capability and functionality to be able to look at it by minute, why wouldn't we be that fair to the agent? And actually, from an agent perspective, when you actually see their working day, those 3 or 4 minutes make all the difference, actually. And you know, as we mentioned, you know, life can sometimes get in the way, and it can mean the difference between a nice walk to the bus following your shift or a mad dash. So, you know, again, that fair and equitable approach allowed us to be able to put a lot of the failure demand of managing such processes manually in the planning team to one side, and then allowed, of course, then the ability for those planners to be able to then use that time to actually start analysing the fact of looking at the trends of time banking, etc., etc., you know, and be able to answer some of the questions of whether our schedules are fit for purpose and aligned with our demand. And so, of course, again, it starts driving that continuous improvement sort of methodology within the planning team that, you know, derives a level of benefit, but also, more importantly, drove a very different and working relationship between the agent and the planner, because, you know, the system was managing the minutes, as it were. What the agent and the leader could do was manage the outcome. And I think that then very much changed the interworking relationship between the two functions. It perhaps didn't become about who you lobbied and who you spoke with on that day. It became fair and equitable, and we were able to then develop that. And look, just as I remember, you know, there is a commercial dynamic to this, of course. You know, we could look at the repositories of time banking and so on before we looked at overtime requirements and so on and so forth. It was another area for us to be able to utilize from a capacity point of view, though that wasn't its main raison d'etre, as it were. What it was really about was ensuring a fair and equitable system. So for us, that piece of functionality, which we didn't go live with right on day one, we wanted to get into the swing of things before we released it, you know, has been a great addition in terms of our planning output and functionality.
Yeah, like you say, it removes all that awkward conversation between agent and team leader where you're going to ask cap in hand for a couple of minutes that you owed from last week. Let's move on, because we mentioned time owed, which is kind of, it's the other side of time banking, which works really well for planning teams and real-time teams. So this feature in a single dashboard summarizes all the minutes owed back to the business through lateness or finishing early or absenteeism and so on. So very easily, planners and real-time teams can broadcast to an entire population of staff that owe time back and ask them to work at the time that they're owed in specific intervals. So you can target a specific time where you know that you're going to be short-staffed, and ask all those agents that owe time to work on that shift. Hugely powerful, right, folks? I imagine this is utilizing the capacity in the business rather than booking additional overtime.
Yeah, completely. And I think, you know, it comes back to a point that we mentioned earlier around, you know, I might be able to see the opportunity, but it doesn't mean I can realize it. And I think, you know, we had data everywhere, but, you know, not anything to really action in a way that was meaningful from a real-time planning point of view, but also from an operational delivery perspective. So again, you know, that time owed piece, I think, is more of a nod to the fact that QStory and its approach, and actually what we were able to develop as a planning approach, was more of an understanding that life can get in the way, and rather than being a kind of, you know, an autocratic approach to how we might process that, we could then start looking at when that time was made up didn't necessarily have to be immediately, but of course what it did give us was the visibility to be able to schedule it in at an appropriate time that was useful for the business, of course, from a planning customer demand perspective, but actually then where we could potentially find time that was more convenient to the agent. So of course that virtuous kind of win-win scenario in a topic that normally would have been so charged with emotion from time back, making time up, all of this kind of stuff has really again been another really important enabler to start changing that relationship between planning and the business, but also then the time that we spend on developing analysis, developing schedules that fit for purpose for our colleagues' needs and requirements, etc., etc. It just again allowed us to free up more time to concentrate on that sort of thing.
Great. Let's talk a bit more about team leaders then, because we've touched on them a little bit. So just think about some of the key challenges that you're looking to solve for team leaders.
Yeah, and look, I've spoken at length often, I think, about our team leader population, and I think, QStory has been massively important to us in terms of enabling, greater delivery from our team leaders, but actually it's the team leaders have made all of this happen to a certain extent. Being able to give such a tool to them to be able to then drive much more connected decision making, a lot more seeing their data in one place. We have unit leads that might have multiple teams across different contact centers, across different geographies, etc., etc. I think being able to see all of their team dynamics in one space, but also in near real time in one view, actually just allowed them then to be able to do what they've always wanted to do, but in a much more empowered way, because they had all of that kind of planning part of their work life, that can often sometimes drive challenges for them, all in one place and sorted for them. So that doesn't mean that those problems and challenges are completely eliminated, but what it did do was it gave them then the ability to use that output in a way that was much more aligned to our customer experience agenda, but also coming back to that adult to adult conversation. The data was the data, and QStory was almost the arbiter of that, but actually what could happen in the moment was team leaders and also unit leaders could utilize the outputs of QStory MI to have more meaningful conversations with their team, and that naturally in some way, shape or form must have improved performance KPIs and dynamics. But I think again the other element of that was that it also allowed team leaders and unit leaders to be able to focus on the behaviors that underpin our customer experience delivery and our ability to delight our customers and all that great stuff that everyone on this call I'm sure will want to do with their respective customers, whilst not having to continually enter into conversations with agents that quite frankly kind of drove an insinuation of mistrust. And so of course being able to start moving away from that, having one data repository for them for all of their needs, they utilize the app as well, they have a different view, but seeing what their agents are seeing, but also the convenience of them being able to see all of their reporting, etc., was a real kind of support tool that allowed us to be able to start accessing some of those performance improvements. We also used an approach that I think was just fundamental to the success, which was we developed this sort of ethos of pioneer sites. So when I reflect on some of the pace of the rollout with QStory, perhaps there was a little bit of just because we could, maybe we doesn't mean we should, and it's really tempting, I think, to see some of these bells and whistles with some of the functionality when actually we probably needed to take a bit more of a step back and understand what functionality we're releasing and when and why, and actually what behavior are we trying to influence, rather than just for the sake of rolling it out. So those pioneer sites were just fundamental in us honing the approach, but also ensuring that what we were delivering was valued by the agent and the team leader, and actually resonated with them in a way that comes full circle back to the original kind of topic around listening to the voice of the employee and trying to change that cultural interaction between them and us, as it were, by removing that notion of them and us. And actually the app again allows that kind of collective consciousness to be able to tackle customer experience challenges, demand, volatility, all of that great stuff becomes, certainly from my perspective anyway, felt a lot more shared, rather than having that kind of stereotypical delineation between planning and the business. You know, I think it became a lot more joined up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been NatWest's intention throughout to reinvest all the time that QStory's identified, right? This wasn't about headcount reduction. Should we just talk a little bit about, I guess, the importance of reinvesting that in some of the key areas like coaching and one-to-ones and some of those learning metrics that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can't. That doesn't resonate with me enough in terms of the ability to reinvest this. You know, I suppose we understood that we're asking our leadership, certainly our operational leadership population, to do something different now in terms of in line with our customer experience aspirations. We just needed as an operation to start behaving differently, but also to start focusing on the things that really, really mattered. And I suppose being able to do that, you know, for me and the rest of the leadership, it was felt that the only way we could access those kind of improvements was by investing in our teams in a way that meant that we could give them more coaching and support, but also to those individuals that needed it, and actually leave alone those individuals that don't. And so being able to kind of have a much more focused sort of intervention approach, and take advantage of perhaps some of the historical planning functional inflexibility that we had because of the nature of our arrival patterns, meant that in essence a lot of this benefit was always there. Again, we just could never access it, and that was because we couldn't in the moment make the right choices quickly enough to reapportion that capacity. And so, you know, having, you know, most of our demand arriving in core hours between sort of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m, albeit, you know, slightly changed across the pandemic, it meant that we had to be able to get to a point where we could understand if that moved, you know, what would be our response. And often what that could mean would be we could dial back particular coaching and particular other segments that we already had planned in. So the ability then to take one step up and look at the threats and opportunities that QStory now allows us to be able to understand better, to make those real-time decisions hand in glove with the operational front of house, has probably been something that is a more important message that underpins some of these great numbers. It would of course been really, really tempting to just realize a lot of that, but I don't feel, and I certainly know, we wouldn't have moved the dial on those really important areas in terms of our operational delivery strategy. So, you know, taking advantage for once of our structural inflexibility in this way has meant that we've been able to access you know, some of these benefits, capacity benefits, with the view of them being able to redeploy them. And these are some really, really great numbers. But I mean, when I look at across, you know, the whole estate, you know, since it started, I mean, invariably that means about 40-50 minutes per agent more coaching given to them over since go live, that's just been accessed through this capability, rather than doing anything radically different. And so that starts to become a really, really important source of capacity for us to be able to fund, you know, these kind of customer experience initiatives that we want to drive, but also to start really supporting our customers in the moment in the way that we want to, much more in line with our brand promises and our brand requirements. You know, starts to become a really, really powerful piece of work. And actually then being able to link together capacity improvements that we've accessed through empowering our team leaders to make some of those choices about being able to redistribute that for their team, for the people that it's right to have that redistributed, again drives that very different interaction then. So real time have generated, for want of a better term, these opportunities but actually it's the business that can have the decision about where to redeploy them and on what topics. So in a very real life example, we can start, being able to view, guys, we're generating this level of capacity, or demand is starting to reduce. Where do you want to reinvest this? And then it allows the front of house leadership to have, direct access to those kind of what would have been historically planning conversations into, well, you know what, I've got these particular headwinds, I've got these particular opportunities, I want to reinvest this capacity in X, Y, and Z. And again, that then became a really powerful conversation for leaders to have, because they felt like they were in control a lot more, they felt like they were driving the agenda. But equally as well, then planning could see the direct relation and correlation between their ability to free up capacity and the performance improvements that we saw for our customers. I think that became a really key message.
Absolutely. Like I said, the crucial fact for me here is that this is capacity that's already inside the business that's just not being utilised. Super powerful. Let's move on to planning teams and real time. I think we've covered most of the key things you're looking to achieve here. Perhaps you talk about some of those really big metrics that you've seen, Phil, in terms of savings and adherence improvements, if you would, please.
Yeah, and again, it's some of the same sort of narrative, I suppose. It was very much, the planning function at NatWest has had to deal with lots of legacy systems, lots of legacy processes from when the business looked very different, and having to sort of try and keep the lights on with some of that, whilst also simultaneously trying to migrate away onto a new approach, really started to, I suppose, underline the approach that, wow, if we could take away some of this sort of failure demand, imagine what they could achieve. And I think that's always been the notion with what QStory has been allowed us to access and think about. And so, we had planning individuals of all sorts of seniorities involved in often quite manual processes, lots and lots of batch files and Excel spreadsheets flying all over the place, lots of points of data, and as a consequence of those, kind of lower level integrations, opportunities for it to fail, and for it to fall over. So QStory being able to take the grunt work of those lower value processes that, don't get me wrong, are low value in terms of from a planner's perspective, because we want them to be doing something else, are still hugely valuable, because if you get them wrong, the implication on everything else is poor. So being able to have an engine in the background that dealt with some of that, most of it for them, again, freed them up into being able to now start looking at either further migrations in our more core planning estate, but equally as well, then starting to be able to look at scenario planning, what if scenarios, and then being able to kind of tackle some of the more institutional failings from our scheduling approach has been key then in being able to move the dial on adherence. I was certainly mindful of the fact when I joined NatWest that some of these adherence targets, there wasn't huge amounts of evidence in some pockets that agent behavior was massively off. It was just our ability to be able to hit our adherence metrics with some of the headwinds of our inflexibility in terms of our scheduling approach, mixed up with our inability to quickly resolve some of those challenges in the moment, meant that we had a small cottage industry pre-QStory in trying to keep some of these processes going, with the only reward of the end of it and once you've done all of that, it just won't fall over, rather than it really moving the dial on anything. So I think being able to drive some of that kind of day-to-day automation meant that the guys could free up on that. Equally as well, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And I think there's a big part of just that pure visibility, everyone looking at the same thing really easily via an app, meant there was a level of, dare I say it, self-management that could be, taken advantage of, so that, when we really hit our straps and we started developing functionality wider and wider, actually our expectation could be measured and managed, and actually then our delivery could be improved, because fundamentally we know the art of the possible now, and actually those same individuals that perhaps couldn't deliver it historically are now delivering against some of these key metrics. And that was again because QStory could get in between those kind of two parties in terms of the dialogue that they had, take away the failure demand, and meant that the conversations the two stakeholders could have were a lot more value add. And then that, in itself, because those behaviours were improved, naturally the KPIs we saw an uptick in.
We see that across a lot of our business that we work with, that common theme of there's plenty of data inside a business, but actually surfacing, I guess, the right level of data is often a real challenge. I think QStory is really good at pulling together a single set of dashboards and reports that shines a light on some of these key metrics. So final section, just moving on to the leadership team. So I think we've covered a lot of this already, but just thinking about some of those key things that QStory's enabled you as a leadership team to do better.
I think there's a couple of things that's enabled us to do better, but I suppose the fundamental thing it's given us is choices. Choice of which operational street to go down. Often, and I'm sure people on the call this will resonate with. Often there are a number of ways of achieving an operational output, of achieving an operational goal, but actually the one that works best for the organization isn't necessarily the one that's always chosen. The output could be delivered, absolutely, but I think, for me, what it feels like a lot more is that it allows us to focus in on the areas that are causing us disproportionate problems, and then be able to solve them collaboratively across planning and front of house. So for me, that transparency, that visibility and ease of use, and we're all discussing the same number, has meant that naturally that's driven a level of sort of management improvement, because actually we're not dealing with all of the stuff beforehand that actually would have never delivered any value anyway, or more importantly, we had to eliminate from our thinking first before we could go on and actually solution the fundamental fix to what we were seeing. So I think that's one big part from a leadership point of view, and I think as well, from a pan bank perspective, it gives us choices as well in terms of, as we slowly roll out in particular areas using QStory, then we naturally know that across retail banking that our operation will be fundamentally treated the same regardless of product or unit area, because they will naturally be adopting some of the methodologies that QStory has given us, so therefore naturally approaching the operational challenge in the same way. So now being able to talk to other planning teams across the bank in often very distant brands, actually bringing to bear some of the learnings for the initial kind of rollout sets us up really, really well. And I think where we are now is really taking advantage of that ability to be able to just incrementally configure the platform and leverage the original development, original configuration, firewall stuff and all that great things that we did last year. Now each time I want to look to roll out more licenses, is a lot more of a plug and play, and then it's actually about making it locally agreeable to the business unit, and actually that's achieved through them being fundamentally involved in the rollout process. So if they want that button yellow instead of orange because yellow is a really important color to them in their business unit, hey look, we can accommodate that. But fundamentally, from my perspective, from a more centralized function, the actual inherent approach is the same. So being able to allow that local variation whilst also driving from a pan bank point of view, a high level of standardization, a high level of visibility that allows us to take advantage now, not just of capacity within business units, but actually intra-business units, for me becomes really, really powerful. And I think, is certainly an area we want to kind of look at further. So I think those are some of the key points from a leadership point of view. But also, I think finally, connectedness. So being able to understand right from the agent activity and and behaviour through to the strategic resource deployment decisions that we now need to make as a consequence of all those interactions. That drives confidence, it drives further transparency, and again means you're not taking up management time with failure demand.
Fantastic. I think the final area we were just going to cover off was what's next. What's next for NatWest and QStory together?
Well, look, I'm really trying to. I've drunk the Kool-Aid on this one in terms of how it can give us choices from a leadership point of view, but also, more importantly, I think where it can position the planning function. I think, you know, this tool is massively important from an enabling that whole interaction between planning and the business in a way that perhaps we haven't been able to do before. So I think that really bodes well for being able to exploit the planning team more as an agent of change, as a team that can drive operational transformation, as a team that can very quickly hone in on the problem areas, the focus requirements, to be able to engender operational change in a way that means the customer will value it every time, but also, you know, does address those bottom line requirements that we all have to address. So I think that that's a really important part, and also, you know, that whole cultural agenda, being able to now position our planning team to be able to support cultural change is probably novel and new for us, and perhaps something certainly within an operation you wouldn't necessarily have thought that could be the case. So I suppose taking advantage of its optimization approaches is probably a key area that, you know, I'm certainly looking at, and that would follow, you know, the ability to be able to integrate with our learning management system. So now that I have, you know, a really good understanding in the moment of my distribution of my workforce, how can I now fire them learning content in a way that's really appropriate for them, not just in the moment, but in the actual day, that we can then integrate with performance outputs. That means that we're constantly giving them appropriate content, that means that their quality and customer experience will be maintained. That's certainly one big area that I'm looking at, but also, you know, with that in mind, how can it then be a central repository for driving our operational MI, you know, and linking and joining the dots operationally. I think it also, you know, the final point I think really supports this, you know, just to lean back to the forum that I'm on at the moment. I think what this also really excitingly does is drive a level of specialization in inter-day and intraday optimization. I think real-time, this type of approaches, tools and techniques actually starts to become its own discipline, I think, to some extent. So thinking about how you can interrelate that to your scheduling function, your forecasting function as well, I think is going to become something really interesting, but also powerful. So I think, you know, being able to challenge the stereotypical makeup of a planning function, where that's staffed from, how that's staffed from, and in which ways, I think are all really kind of you know, important, exciting areas for us, and developing again that new interaction between our agents and us as a workforce generally. You know, being able to drive that adult to adult conversation, being able to drive that much more, you know, empowered, honest, transparent relationship, for me then has the potential to cut out a lot of that failure demand from a conversational point of view within the operational environment, because now we're all in it together to a certain extent, rather than me telling you what time your shift starts, what time it finishes, and everything you have to do therein. Maybe we can start challenging it that the agent is the best person to tell us what they need, and then therefore be a lot more bought into the performance improvements that they then support. So taking right the way through that to notions of the power of one, you know, all of that kind of thing, you can really see how they all knit together. And for me, that's, you know, the direction of travel that we want to go on.
Hugely powerful. Thanks, Phil. That's really informative. I think we've got time. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions from anyone in the audience.
Yeah, cheers, guys. Really enjoyed that. I mean, you know, the transformation it's made for NatWest, Phil, sounds incredible. So yeah, we have got a few questions. So got a couple that we'll go through. So one that's coming from Danny is allowing the front line to request coaching time via QStory. Did this open up an element of risk or misuse, or not? Or can we mitigate that? Because obviously, I think it's that nervousness that people have about letting people, do these things. How did you kind of make sure that it wasn't open to misuse, or how did you control that?
Yeah, and look, it's a great question, and I appreciate some of this can't be done through just a kind of step of trust into the unknown. But of course, QStory allows you to set those parameters. It allows you to set the kind of, I suppose, the safety rails on the start on it. So in terms of the opportunities that you can allow from a real-time point of view, that will still be naturally defined by your supply and demand dynamics. So none of that changes, but what we're allowed to do though is that the spending of that time, of that shrinkage, of idle time, however you want to kind of talk about it, actually what we're now saying is in this controlled environment, that can be up to the team leader or the agent in terms of how they ingest that time. Because the flip side of it is that because we're assuming a level of accountability on their behalf, that if they don't do that, they won't hit the performance metrics, the quality scores that we want them to. So of course, naturally would be a performance reduction. So it wouldn't be in sort of everybody's vested interest. But that's also where the pioneer site approach came in really, really handy. We could, be a bit radical in some areas in the controlled environment and see how people reacted and how they used it. One thing that I've been and continue to be amazingly surprised about and really buoyed by was actually the amount of that behavior that we saw was minimal. And I think the reason for that was because it's just so transparent. Everyone sees the number that you're all looking at, and if we've given a load of coaching opportunity and either none of it's taken or it's taken with no discernible output, then again the conversation becomes a lot more performance driven from the team leader and with the planner, and they actually become a lot more, dare I say, emotive conversations because a level of trust has been broken, rather than why didn't you do those 5 little bits of work I sent you on time. So I suppose the backdrop with some of this is, and it's a journey we're still very much going on and are not near the end of, is actually that cultural change, that difference in that frame of reference, these adult to adult conversations. That was what the really underpinning output of this was to be able to change that so that actually that behavior was eradicated. But yeah, there are those guardrails you can put in place.
No, thanks for that, Phil. That's really good. Dennis says thanks for that. He's happy with that answer, which is great. I think it is. I think if you say that the pioneer sites, being able to try some of these, and make that, test the assumption. We think this is how people are going to behave with this, but let's just check that and be able to do that. Having a mechanism is really insightful. I'm just going to take one more because I like to release people a few minutes before, so they've got. So I know we're all back to back. So kind of last question is, it's one of the slides said about reducing lateness from I think it was 1,000 hours to 50 hours a week. How did actually QStory enable that? Just to be clear.
Do you want me to take that one, Phil?
Yeah, you go for it if you want, Nick. Yeah.
Sure. So again, this is about, I guess, shining a light on metrics that already exist inside the business. We surfaced that actually lateness was a problem in one particular business unit, to the tune of 1,000 hours. We then used things like time mode notifications to say that actually this was being logged and recorded, and actually could you make up this time as soon as possible. We also use proactive nudges inside the app. So when the app detects that agents are doing work but haven't logged on, the app can proactively nudge them to say it's time to log in and start your day. So both those two metrics were key in just, I guess, shining a light on increasing the visibility of this lateness and saying actually it's not being unmissed. This is now being recorded, and we're looking for you to actually work those hours that you're being paid for.
No, excellent. That's really good. Phil, anything to add to what Nick said there, or I think that's fair enough?
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so yeah, so with 5 minutes up to the hour, I just want to again thank Nick and Phil for taking us through this story. I think one thing I took from this as well is that just because we could have, you know, we can do it, doesn't mean we should do it, you know. And having a look at this, it's always something like this. It's around, you only get one run at it, don't you? So you've got to kind of land it right. You've got your pioneer site, so you've got that. But once it's out of that kind of safe environment, you've got to make sure that you know, trying to bring something back or relaunch it again is really difficult in this sort of thing. So I think that was a really good takeaway that I took from this. So really appreciate everybody's attention. Big thanks to QStory for, you know, conducting this webinar in partnership with the forum. We have further webinars coming up over the coming months. We have obviously the conferences looming, which will be on it before we know. And yeah, and really thank everybody's attention today. So I'll give you a few minutes back and we will see you again. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.